Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual education program at Cancer Support Community South Bay. I'm Rebecca, the program manager, and I welcome you to this workshop titled Inflammation, Gut Health, and Cancer. Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, CSC South Bay's mission is to uplift and strengthen people impacted by cancer by providing support, fostering compassionate communities, and breaking down barriers to care. Our vision is that everyone impacted by cancer receives the support they want and need throughout their experience. We serve the South Bay, Long Beach, and Orange County area all at no cost. Our program includes support groups, networking groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and educational programs like this workshop. Educational programs are open to all. If you'd like to hear more about our services or join our community, please visit our website at cscsouthbay.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, we ask you to keep your microphone muted to eliminate any distracting background noise. Please feel free to enter any general questions into the chat function found at the bottom of the Zoom window at any time, and Marissa will address them at the end of her presentation. Without further ado, I'll introduce our workshop speaker. Marissa Minderler is a registered dietitian who currently works as both an inpatient and outpatient clinical dietitian at Torrance Memorial. Graduating from USC with her master's in nutrition, health, and longevity, and a bachelor's in kinesiology, she has always had an interest in the role of nutrition in weight management, fitness and performance, and in women's health. Most recently, she has taken to exploring the role of nutrition in cancer and how it can assist with prevention, management of treatment, and survivorship. Thank you so much, Marissa, for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining me on your lunch, I'm assuming, or perhaps if you have Friday off, congratulations. But thank you for taking your time to sit with me today while we discuss inflammation, gut health, and cancer. So today we'll be discussing, just generally what inflammation is. We'll talk a little bit about the types of inflammation. I'll go into some details about those. And then we'll discuss really what the causes of inflammation are and some lifestyle and dietary factors that can relate to how inflammation occurs. We'll also discuss how this, of course, relates to cancer. And then we'll go into some details about the microbiome. So, we'll talk about what it is, and how we can support our gut health. So let's start off with just the basics. So what is inflammation? Well, inflammation is really just a generalized response from our immune system, okay? It's a generalized response in relation to some sort of foreign pathogen or localized injury, right? So we have something called innate and adaptive immunity. So innate immunity is really this like first line of defense, and it's not really very specific, right? So it might be something like our macrophages, or if we've got some sort of cut on our hand, right? We might have a small localized inflammatory response, but it's very non-specific, okay? Then we also have our adaptive immunity. Now, our adaptive immunity is a little bit more specific, and this is where we might see more complex responses to specific viruses or even specific pathogens and bacteria. So, a most obvious example could be COVID or the flu. We have different cells, immune cells like T cells and B cells, that have the ability to produce antibodies to these sorts of bacteria or excuse me, these viruses. So we see that this is sort of just a generalized immune system response to some sort of pathogen or localized injury. Now let's go into some of the details about the types of inflammation. So we see short-term inflammation a lot, and this is what we call acute inflammation. Again, this is really something that occurs after a more specific localized injury, trauma, or some kind of infection. We see this with cuts, we see this with burns, we can see this again with viral or bacterial infections. Maybe you cut your hand and it gets infected and you have to go on antibiotics, right? But we also do see this in instances with cancer. So if there is a tumor that's growing somewhere, there will be some sort of localized systemic inflammatory response. And we kind of see these 5 cardinal signs of inflammation. We see, you might see things like swelling, right? You might see things like redness, right? It might get hot, right? Or you might actually develop a full body fever in the presence of these things. There's also usually pain associated with it, right? And then generally there could be a loss of function. So again, for example, you bang your pinky toe against the coffee table. We've all been there before. We've all done it. We've screamed, we've yelled, maybe it gets red, swollen, it hurts for sure. And we might have difficulty walking. So that could be an example of sort of that short-term acute inflammation. But now we go into something like chronic inflammation. Okay, so chronic inflammation is really this extended duration of various low-level inflammatory processes that will negatively impact our multiple organ systems over time. Okay, so for example, you might see heart disease develop, right? You might see COPD, diabetes, liver disease or cirrhosis, and even cancer, right? So we know that this is much more complicated and it's a more difficult process to understand. And it's generally not just attributed to one specific thing. It's really the culmination of all of these different complex processes. And it typically is something like the perfect storm, right? It's the perfect storm of all these different factors that might add up and create what we call meta-inflammation, right? And this is what's going to cause the damage to those tissues or compromise our metabolic state. So those things underneath here, the stress, the visceral body fat, sleep, sedentary lifestyle, specific dietary factors, and we know environmental exposures as well as smoking are things that can contribute to chronic inflammation. And so we're going to go into detail with those things now. So let's talk about stress. The favorite topic, right? There's different kinds of stress. There's something called eustress, and then there's distress, right? So in this instance, we're going to be talking about distress, right? Eustress is positive. It's something that we see from working out, right? Or maybe if you get a little bit nervous before you give a presentation to a bunch of people. But there's also distress, right? And distress is something that we know causes dysregulation of a variety of different systems. So let's just say you don't have access to healthy fruits and vegetables. You struggle to pay your rent. And over time, these things have compounded and created an immense amount of stress within your body. This causes an upregulation of our HPA axis. Okay, the HPA axis is just a fancy term for your fight or flight response. Okay, and this fight or flight response that is constantly being turned on over and over again causes a dysregulation and a release of different stress hormones. Some stress hormones involve cortisol, and this over time can cause an environment that a tumor can potentially grow. Okay, now it's not so easy to understand, but this sort of complex dysregulation between your hormones, like insulin or estrogen, all of that can create a sort of low-grade inflammation and immune suppression that can promote an area where a tumor might grow. Okay, so let's just say a tumor does start to grow. This chronic stress continues over time. Your immune system struggles with its persistent surveillance of all of these different things. And now we have a microenvironment where it continues to be promoted to grow, right? So the tumor may get bigger, right? And it's very difficult to suppress progression of a tumor, okay? And the tumor will then start to produce something called pro-inflammatory cytokines, okay? All those are, again, fancy terms for these molecules that say there's something wrong. There's a huge state of inflammation that's going on. And this over time will continue to create a cycle. And as you can see, this can lead to a worsening environment for a tumor or a microenvironment that continues to promote tumor growth. Now, visceral fat. Visceral fat is really the fat that's closely tucked around our organs, right? It's not really the stuff that we can grab and that's, flabby that, most of us are like, oh man, I wish I looked better in a bathing suit, or I don't want my arms to flap. It's not that. That is actually more subcutaneous fat. The visceral fat is what's really close and tightly packed within our organs and next to our organs. The more visceral fat that you have, the more pro-inflammatory cytokines or signaling molecules are recruited. Okay, so you can see from that picture there that the more visceral adipose tissue that a person might obtain or develop, you can see those macrophages, those T cells, and it also promotes blood flow, right? We get new, it's called angiogenesis, right? And so all of this can compound over time and once again create an environment that makes it, number one, harder to lose weight. It increases specific hormones that can make us not feel full and satisfied, regardless of the types of foods that we eat. And it also can create an environment that releases something called IGF-1, which is known to be a pro-growth or cancer-promoting signaling molecule. Okay, so you can see that even a small amount of visceral fat is likely not to be of concern, but let's just say we're really stressed, we're eating too many calories, we're not exercising, and we develop a greater amount of visceral fat. That can create a microenvironment next to our fat that can promote a tumor growth. Now let's touch on sleep. We all love sleep, but sometimes it doesn't come the way that we wish, right? Unfortunately, poor sleep and poor sleep quality, so not enough sleep, and not good quality sleep, is actually associated with greater inflammation. Okay, poor sleep duration and quality is also associated with difficulty with weight loss efforts. So if you don't sleep enough, and you're trying to eat well and you're trying to exercise, it won't necessarily help because if you're not sleeping enough, you can prevent weight loss. Okay. Um, Poor sleep also increases our fight or flight response. Once again, our stress response, right? We oftentimes crave sugary things, processed foods. Maybe we want a lot more caffeine, right? All of that is in to help our body get some energy, right, for the lack of sleep. And we know that chronically over time, poor sleep might be associated with other chronic conditions like high blood pressure, dementia, and even sleep apnea can get worse, right? So sleeping is essential. It's so, so important. It's where our brain and our body recover, and it's where they rest. Now, you may have heard the term sitting is the new smoking. Um, while that's not exactly true, we do know that sitting is really not very beneficial for us from a longevity standpoint, right? So, a lack of physical activity, a lack of this sustained exercise, sitting for more than 8 hours a day, which unfortunately happens a lot, maybe due to commutes or due to working behind a desk or sitting and watching TV, right? We know that all of these things are more closely associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Um, it can lead to weight gain and excess body fat simply because maybe we're eating too many calories and our metabolism just slows down the more that we sit, right? Um, it can also increase our risk of diabetes. Once again, we know it increases our risk of cancer and really specifically Alzheimer's and dementia. We're seeing a very large connection between the power of exercise and reducing your risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. So really, we're seeing a conglomeration of a lot of different things, right? We're seeing that stress, that excess body fat, that poor sleep, that and a sedentary lifestyle, all of these really truly increase our risk greatly of all of these other chronic conditions. So I'm going to spend a lot more time on the dietary factors because this is a big topic, obviously, and the point of our conversation. So the first dietary factor I'm going to discuss is a high saturated fat intake. Okay. We know that high amounts of saturated fat is more closely associated with increased cholesterol. Okay. And specifically your LDL. Okay. And LDL is the sticky cholesterol. Okay. It's the cholesterol that pockets itself inside your arteries, your heart, your brain, and it causes buildup and plaque buildup. Okay. And this chronic plaque buildup will lead to essentially poor cardiovascular function, right? It can lead to stroke, it can lead to heart attack, It can lead to a lot of things. So increased saturated fat is found in a lot of your common foods, snack foods, right? Cookies, cakes, chocolates, ice cream, fried foods, right? So chips, French fries, fried chicken, burgers, right? We also see high saturated fat in things like pizza, beef, pork, and lamb. And we'll also see high amounts of saturated fat in things like processed meats, so hot dogs. Not as much deli meats, but the deli and cured meats have sort of a secondary factor when it comes to all of this. And all of these foods are more closely associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer. Okay, so we'll discuss that in a little bit. Now, sort of in conjunction with maybe increased intake of snacky foods and things like that, we're also seeing a lower intake of fruits and vegetables. Okay, so people are just not meeting the guidelines that we need to get enough fruits and vegetables. Okay, so we know for certain that a lower intake of fruits and vegetables is associated with poorer health outcomes across the board and a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, specifically colorectal cancer, also just other GI cancers, so stomach, your oral, esophageal, and lung, okay? And we know that a lower intake of fruits and vegetables puts you at a greater risk of having excess body fat and a risk of type 2 diabetes. So I want to do a brief poll question, okay? Feel free to pop your answers into the chat box, okay? So your question is, what percentage of adults meet the US dietary guidelines for daily fruit intake? What is your guess? A, B, C, D? Throw it in the chat box. Love to see the participation. I'm seeing A's. I'm seeing a couple B's, a couple C's, more A's, B's, seeing more A's and B's than C's. I think maybe our A's and B's are almost tied. So the answer is B, 12%, okay? Less than, it's really actually just shy above 12%, but about 12% of adults, that's it, are having enough fruit for the entire day, okay? We recommend about 1.5 to 2 cups of fruit on a daily basis, okay? This could be a half a cup of blueberries, a half of a banana, and a handful of grapes. That's a cup and a half in total, right? That's all you need for a whole day. And only 12% of adults are meeting this. Okay. Next question. What percentage of adults are meeting the vegetable intake guidelines? So that was fruit. What do you guys think is the percentage of adults that are meeting the vegetable intake? Let's see it in the chat box. C, A, C, B. We're getting a little more even here. Seeing more C's, B's, got A's, B's, C's. Okay. It seems almost kind of even here a little bit. 10%. Okay, the answer is B, 10%. Okay, so even less than fruit, which was expected, unfortunately. But only 10%. That means 1 out of every 10 people. Okay, there are 55 people in this chat. Only 5 are eating enough veggies. That's not good. That's not good. Okay, so our daily recommendation is 2 to 4 cups of vegetables per day. And when we say vegetables, we primarily mean these non-starchy vegetables, right? Your broccoli, your cauliflower, your kale, your spinach, your zucchini, your squash, right? Your cucumber, right? So we're talking about these when we think about these non-starchy vegetables, okay? So it's safe to say we have some room for improvement. All right, let's talk very briefly about an increased consumption of ultra-processed foods. Now, this has gotten a lot of attention lately, and I think, unfortunately, it is a somewhat nuanced conversation. We could probably spend an entire hour, 30 minutes talking about just this topic in general, okay? But as a base, okay, our foods are categorized generally into 4 different groups according to what we call the NOVA classification, okay? Group 1 is considered to be mostly unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Again, these are your whole fruits and vegetables, your fresh, your frozen. It's your things like your grains, like oatmeal or rice, your pasta even, and other minimally processed foods like milk, Greek yogurt, chicken, right? Any sort of minimally processed animal protein like chicken breast, ground turkey. Okay, so these are ideally, the category of foods that we would emphasize most in a diet, right? Now, as we move down the chart, right, as we go to group 2, group 3, and group 4, we get to what's called the more ultra processed, right? So groups 3 and 4 are processed and ultra processed foods. And technically, an ultra processed food would be something like Cheetos, chips, Oreos, cakes, cookies. Once again, a lot of those foods in the beginning that I mentioned, right? Your snack foods, um, flavored yogurts, right? Like Yoplait, okay? We also see certain frozen foods, right, that are going to be in here. Soft drinks, candy, okay? Also your smoked meats, right, are going to be in here a little bit. So all of these types of foods, okay, are actually more closely associated with an increased risk of GI-related disorders and GI cancer, okay? But what we're not really putting 2 and 2 together is that some of these foods are not inherently harmful by themselves, and many of these foods are technically demonized by the food industry, right? But it tends to be the risk is because they are consumed in excess and without the presence of some of these whole unprocessed foods, right? We're not eating enough fruits. We're not eating enough vegetables, right? But we're over consuming these ultra processed forms of these things. And this is where that imbalance is happening, right? If you're consuming a mostly whole, unprocessed diet with a sprinkle of some of these ultra processed foods, it's unlikely that your risk is going to go up. If you're meeting the dietary guidelines of getting enough fruits and vegetables and grains and beans, it's unlikely that your risk is going to increase if you have sporadic intake of ultra processed foods. But we think about a balance, right? It's all about the balance. Many people are not meeting this guideline of eating a mostly unprocessed diet, and they're over consuming ultra processed foods. So that's where we're seeing this increase in risk. These are just a couple different studies and meta-analyses that were found to increase risk of both inflammation as well as risk of colorectal cancer in the presence of eating more ultra-processed foods. This is on my reference slide for you guys to look at and review later should you choose to. But essentially, we know that excess ultra-processed food consumption is associated with a little bit more inflammation and low-grade inflammation of the GI tract. And it's also closely correlated to an increased risk of colorectal cancer. Okay, I talked a lot about all of those factors, right? The stress, the sedentary lifestyle, poor sleep, dietary factors, right? So I briefly mentioned some connection to cancer, right? But how does it all really tie in, right? What really is this deeper connection? Well, just as there is no single cause for cancer, there is really no single mechanism that's going to dictate the connection between inflammation and cancer occurrence. As I mentioned before, low-level inflammation is very hard to measure. It's very complex, and it's sort of it's all about the perfect storm, right? If we have a lot of low-level inflammation and it gradually progresses and worsens over time, from all of those metabolic derangements that can then change and alter some genetic expression, which can increase our risk of cancer occurrence, right? So inflammation really does affect our total body state of being. But again, when we think about inflammation, we think about how it impacts our risk of cancer, okay? We don't know for 100% that we can prevent cancer, but we know all of it comes down to risk, right? Our own relative risk. So cancer is the culmination, or cancer risk, excuse me, is related to this culmination of our diet, our lifestyle, and genetic factors, some of which we can't control. We cannot control our genetics, right? In certain situations, we cannot control our environment or our environmental exposure, right? But we do have other preventative habits that usually relate to lifestyle, to diet, that we can adjust, right? In certain situations, there's more privilege than others, where your preventative habits can outweigh your own relative risk. And ultimately, that is our goal. We want all of those preventative habits to outweigh any potential relative risk that we might have as it relates to cancer. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this particular quote, but Hippocrates, way back in the day, he had this quote that said, "All disease begins in the gut." Now, I would say that he wasn't probably 100% accurate, but he's definitely onto something, right? And I think that this promotes our next topic, right? And our next conversation that relates to the microbiome and gut health, okay? Every single food, everything we put into our bodies, right? It goes through our GI tract, right? Every piece of fruit, every soda, every drop of water, right? Everything we consume has to go through the gut. So there's definitely some merit to this conversation, in a sense that maybe what we eat matters, right? What we eat has to affect our gut. So let's talk a little bit about the microbiome. So the microbiome is generally comprised of a lot of these different areas, and it's comprised of the different viruses, the different bacteria. We have archaea and fungi. Archaea are a type of bacteria. Fungi, protozoa, and parasites. We have all of these things on us, among us, within us, right? And this is officially what we define as the microbiota, right? These are the microbiota. Now we have these different locations, so to speak, of where there's different concentrations of these types of things. We have our oral microbiome. For some people who have gone through head and neck cancer, a very common side effect of radiation and chemotherapy is what's called thrush. And thrush is where you get a fungal infection in your mouth. It's very painful, it's very uncomfortable, right? So we know that treatments can affect our microbiome, right? There's the breast microbiome. There's our respiratory or lung microbiome. For many people who have had some sort of viral infection, or perhaps they've had some sort of, we can say maybe an aspiration risk where they've had some food and it got into their lungs, and maybe they've got pneumonia from this, right? We know that there's an impact there with the lung, right? Our skin, right? Our skin has bacteria, it has fungi on it, right? The main principle between the conversation of washing your hands before and after you eat, right? Don't touch your face after you've touched, a public doorknob, right? All of those things, right? Our skin. But the most common one, and the one that we really want to pay most attention to as it relates to food, is our GI microbiome, right? Our gut microbiome. So that's what we're going to discuss further. So on the picture on the left, you see our large colon, okay? Now, the colonic bacteria, that's primarily what we're talking about here, okay? So you see on the left-hand side, you've got your ascending colon, you've got your transverse, that's that loop that goes across the top, and then your descending colon, okay? The microbiome is essentially a lot of different bacteria all throughout this whole tract, okay? Now, if we take a deeper look or a closer look, and we just cut out a small little piece of our colon, right? A little wall of the colon. And we zoom in, this is what we're gonna see, okay? We see the purple here. These are gonna be those epithelial cells lining what are called the villi. Okay, we call those finger-like projections. And there's a bunch of viscous gel type mucus involved in that section, okay? And then of course you'll see different muscles, right? We are all familiar with muscles of our colon. We got peristalsis, things that move move things along through the GI tract so that the muscles will contract to help move things along. Now, if we were to zoom in on the mucosa, okay, we see this picture on the right. Okay, in this picture on the right, you'll see these single epithelial cells. This is just one single cell layer, okay? The inside of that is where our microbiome is. That's where all those little gut bacteria, that's where all those little guys are sitting and hanging out, okay? So food, as we digest food, it's going to go through this lumen section here, and it's going to come into contact with our microbiota and all of those epithelial cells, right? You can see on the other side of these epithelial cells is where our immune cells are hanging out. Has anybody heard the term that your 70% of your immune system lies in your gut? If you have, this is where that concept came from, right? You can see that a dendritic cell, a macrophage, all of these other T cells, right? These are all very closely connected, one thin cell layer away from our microbiome. And this is where people are studying and researchers are studying to try to understand how food and how our gut health is directly impacting our immune system and our immune function. So I have a video to play. Okay, I'm going to switch my screen over. And this video is about 5 minutes. Okay, and it's going to discuss a little bit of the microbiome.
Trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi live on or inside of us, and maintaining a good, balanced relationship with them is to our advantage. Together, they form the gut microbiome, a rich ecosystem that performs a variety of functions in our bodies. The bacteria in our guts can break down food the body can't digest, produce important nutrients, regulate the immune system, and protect against harmful germs. We don't yet have the blueprint for exactly which good bacteria a robust gut needs, but we do know that it's important for a healthy microbiome to have a variety of bacterial species. Many factors affect our microbiomes, including our environment, medications like antibiotics, and even whether we were delivered by C-section or not. Diet, too, is emerging as one of the leading influences on the health of our guts. And while we can't control all these factors, we can manipulate the balance of our microbes by paying attention to what we eat. Dietary fiber from foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains is the best fuel for gut bacteria. When bacteria digest fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids that nourish the gut barrier, improve immune function, and can help prevent inflammation, which reduces the risk of cancer. And the more fiber you ingest, the more fiber-digesting bacteria colonize your gut. In a recent study, scientists exchanged the regular high-fiber diets of a group of rural South Africans with the high-fat, meat-heavy diets of a group of African Americans. After just 2 weeks on the high-fat, low-fiber, Western-style diet, the rural African group showed increased inflammation of the colon as well as a decrease of butyrate. That's a short-chain fatty acid thought to lower risk of colon cancer. Meanwhile, the group that switched to a high-fiber, low-fat diet had the opposite result. So what goes wrong with our gut bacteria when we eat low-fiber processed foods? Lower fiber means less fuel for the gut bacteria, essentially starving them until they die off. This results in less diversity and hungry bacteria. In fact, some can even start to feed on the mucus lining. We also know that specific foods can affect gut bacteria. In one recent microbiome study, scientists found that fruits, vegetables, tea, coffee, red wine, and dark chocolate were correlated with increased bacterial diversity. These foods contain polyphenols, which are naturally occurring antioxidant compounds. On the other hand, foods high in dairy fat, like whole milk, and sugar-sweetened sodas were correlated with decreased diversity. How food is prepared also matters. Minimally processed, fresh foods generally have more fiber and provide better fuel. So lightly steamed, sautéed, or raw vegetables are typically more beneficial than fried dishes. There are also ways of preparing food that can actually introduce good bacteria, also known as probiotics, into your gut. Fermented foods are teeming with helpful probiotic bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Originally used as a way of preserving foods before the invention of refrigeration, fermentation remains a traditional practice all over the world. Foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, tempeh, and kombucha provide variety and vitality to our diets. Yogurt is another fermented food that can introduce helpful bacteria into our guts. That doesn't necessarily mean that all yogurt is good for us, though. Brands with too much sugar and not enough bacteria may not actually help. These are just general guidelines. More research is needed before we fully understand exactly how any of these foods interact with our microbiomes. We see positive correlations, but the insides of our guts are difficult places to make direct observations. For instance, we don't currently know whether these foods are directly responsible for the changes in diversity, or if something more complicated is happening. While we're only beginning to explore the vast wilderness inside our guts, we already have a glimpse of how crucial our microbiomes are for digestive health. The great news is we have the power to fire up the bacteria in our bellies. Fill up on fibers, fresh and fermented foods, and you can trust your gut to keep you going strong.
Where does bread get its fluffiness? Swiss cheese gets whole.
Right. Let me switch sharing my screen again. All right. What a great video, right? I think that just summarizes so much about the simplicity of how we should eat, right? I think nowadays things have gotten so out of hand and complicated, and there's so much movement away from the simple concept of eating fruits and vegetables, right? Eating whole foods, eating your fiber, right? So as we saw in that video, right, the gut microbiome is highly modulatory, right? We know that our food choices matter, right? Everything we put in our mouth matters, right? We actually also see some adjustments to the microbiome when there's exercise, right? So intense exercise or positive or even light exercise, really any exercise of any kind can positively influence our microbiome. We saw from a negative perspective that stress can actually affect our microbiome. You know, we've all heard this term, your gut feeling, right? Or what does your gut tell you? And like, oh, I have a stress-filled gut, right? Maybe some people get, diarrhea if they get stressed out, or some people become constipated when they stressed out. All of this just goes to show that this environment is modulatory and everything is affected, okay? There's something called your vagus nerve, right? The vagus nerve goes from your brain into your GI tract. They've done studies in mice that they have severed the vagus nerve, and they actually express like forms of or almost forms of like dementia and Alzheimer's, right? So we know that the gut actually has a strong influence on things that happen in our brain and our mood and everything. So the gut is highly modulatory. Okay. If people have been through treatment for cancer or are going through treatment, the chemotherapies, different medications, radiation, all of these things also affect your microbiome. There's specific chemotherapies that can destroy the lining, right, and ruin the mucosa just as a secondary result. So, eating and having good quality nutrition, as we saw in the video, eating fruits and vegetables can restore that lining of your microbiome, or excuse me, of your GI tract. I know there's probably going to be some conversations later about supplements and about probiotics. Probiotics, there's a it's mixed with regards to whether or not they're efficacious or not. In certain situations, the actual capsules, the supplements of probiotics may be effective. But knowing what strains, knowing how many, it's very difficult to understand all of that. And research is trying to dive into that a little bit more. But unfortunately, the wellness industry has really capitalized on a lot of this. The wellness industry has pushed people to take more capsules and more pills than anything ever, right? And a lot of this is not regulated. And we know that, again, this is probably affecting our microbiome. But is it affecting it in a positive way? We don't really know, right? But as we saw from the video, one of the most impactful foods that we can have is fiber, okay? So the ingestion of fiber causes your gut bacteria to create something called short chain fatty acids. Okay, they mentioned that in the video. And these short chain fatty acids actually travel to different places in your body. They travel to your liver, they travel to your brain, but obviously they also stay concentrated in your gut, and they actually help repair your GI tract and your gut lining. So the more fiber that you eat, the more those little organisms are going to ferment and create more short chain fatty acid production. And we saw that was protective against a lot of disorders, including cancer. So we talked about a lot, but in conclusion, right, we know that inflammation is complicated, right? It's not that simple, but we know that low levels of inflammation can compound over time and create a hospitable environment for disease to grow or disease to progress, okay? But ultimately, to help reduce our inflammation, we want to try to engage in preventative habits that can reduce our risk of contracting or developing any of these chronic conditions. We need to exercise. We need to sleep. We need to manage our stress. We need to try to focus on quality nutrition. 1.5 to 2 cups of fruit, 2 to 4 cups of veggies each day, right? And we know that those can help reduce our relative risk of cancer. All of these things in conjunction will also help promote a healthy microbiome, right? We know that if we eat mostly whole, unprocessed foods, mostly plants, we know that the diet rich in grains and beans and fruits and veggies and some fermented products is going to help support our GI tract and a healthy microbiome. So I hope that this was helpful, and I hope that this makes sense. These are my references for anybody who's interested. Quite a few studies that were in there. And the YouTube video was just a TED Ed. I love TED Ed. TED Ed has lots of great information. And as I said, I'm one of the dietitians at Torrance Memorial. So if anybody is interested, we do one-on-one consultations. We also have classes that are dedicated to cancer and nutrition. Okay. So for any information, please refer to our website, torrancememorial.org/nutrition, or feel free to call that number if you'd like to seek interest in a one-on-one appointment. I really appreciate everybody's time, and I think we'll be taking some questions now. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and perhaps Rebecca, you can moderate. Or
Yes, absolutely. If you are able to, can you go back to the reference page? I know you just stopped sharing.
No problem.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
We did have a question about slides. Are you able to email me your slides? Are you comfortable sharing that?
I can do that.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No problem. Can you guys see the reference page?
Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Sure.
All right. So for everyone online, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. So I think when you're talking about the group one of like not minimal processed to ultra processed, I think there was yogurt in the ultra processed. But I think I also saw that in the group one. You mentioned Yoplait, so they were just like questioning yogurt is ultra processed? ? Oh no.
Okay, so technically yogurt is also fermented, right? It is processed, right? But just because it is processed doesn't mean that it's 100% unhealthy. So again, this is sort of that complicated, nuanced conversation, right? Just because it is processed doesn't mean that it's unhealthy. The reason why, I'll go back to that slide actually, and pull up the classification there. So make my screen a little bigger. So the reason why it's ultra processed towards the bottom is because it's flavored. Okay, so they're adding sugar. they're adding these things. So the processing is classified based on whether or not it adds salt, it adds sugar, it adds all of these different things, okay? So again, it's sort of a nuanced conversation, but ultra processed has a lot to do with what else they also add into it, right? So Greek yogurt though is known to be healthy, but Yoplait on the other hand, it doesn't have any of those positive probiotics. It has mostly added sugars and very minimal amounts of protein and things like that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. All right, next question. Are dill pickles fermented foods?
Yeah. Yeah. And they are known to be very healthy. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you just briefly talk about, in terms of fiber, the difference between juicing versus blending?
Great question. Yeah. So juicing really just extracts the water content, it extracts the vitamins, and it doesn't usually pull in a lot of that fiber from a fruit or a vegetable. But if you place the whole vegetable, a whole fruit into a blender, you're retaining all of the fiber and all of the nutrients that come with it. So essentially, you're able to maintain more fiber content in a fully blended smoothie type version versus if you were to just juice and extract some of the liquid and the sugars from it.
Wonderful. So you mentioned about, if you have like a good diet of fruits and vegetables and exercise, sporadic intake of ultra processed foods is okay. So what is considered an acceptable amount of sporadic intake of ultra processed foods?
Yeah, I don't know that answer, right? I think that's where there's a spectrum, right? Do we say on a daily basis? Do we say on a weekly basis? Are we talking about over the span of months, years, right? I think that's a very complicated thing to answer, and I think I don't really, as a dietitian, I really don't even know how to answer that question, right?
Very specific to each person. So I think in the video, or talk about like red wine and chocolate and fruits and veggies. So what's a safe number, I guess? And then are light beers okay?
So the American Institute for Cancer Research, okay, this is abbreviated the AICR, okay? They have a website, it's called the AICR.org, and they have what's called the 10 steps for cancer prevention, and they talk about limiting alcohol consumption. The recommendation that they have, and also this is something in the dietary guidelines for Americans, is no more than one standard alcoholic drink per day. Okay, a standard drink is 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces, excuse me, of wine, and or 1.5 or one shot essentially of liquor or hard alcohol. That is the recommendation. Now we're seeing from in a lot of other, cancer spaces and in research spaces, that less is more, right? That really as little alcohol intake as possible is best when it comes to trying to lower your risk. Again, it's very similar to the conversation of how much ultra processed food is okay, how much alcohol is okay. Again, that's very individual and it's hard to say, but that's the recommendation that organization has, no more than one standard drink per day.
Wonderful, thank you. This is a specific one. Any suggestions for diet after C. diff? Taking physician's choice 60 billion probiotic with prebiotic.
Okay, yeah. So as far as diet, after C. diff, I guess I would just say, you kind of have to gradually increase your fiber again because, C. diff sort of has ruined your GI tract a little bit. It's made it probably a little bit more sensitive to things. So it just takes time to slowly rebuild your gut bacteria and things like that. The probiotic might be okay. I'm not able to really offer a lot of specifics with that because I would have to see it and probably provide more one-on-one advice in relation to other things. But generally, just gradually adding in fiber after your to slowly get to your normal food intake from what you were doing before is recommended.
Thank you. We have a baker here. I'm on a lot of sourdough baking websites. Participants often tout the benefit of the cooked fermented dough. bread is cooked at 450 degrees, well above the temperature that would kill the probiotic. They say that it still has prebiotics. Thoughts?
So remember the prebiotic, let me again go to my slide that talked about the fiber here, right? So a prebiotic is really any sort of plant food that has fiber, right? So most sourdough bread actually does not have a lot of fiber associated with it. So technically the prebiotic nature of that particular bread is not always, it doesn't have a high amount of fiber, right? So it may not have a high amount of prebiotics. That doesn't mean that it's unhealthy, right? Because it's interesting that you say that with the bacteria, because we do say that sourdough bread has positive effects on the GI tract because of the type of bacteria that used to ferment the dough. So I think again it's very complicated. This is, and just like the video said, it's hard to know, we can't take a glass and look exactly what's going on. As soon as somebody eats sourdough bread, what is that doing further down the chute? We're having to make some assumptions here. So I would say that I think still sourdough bread is a great thing to have. I'm not a sourdough hater.
Wonderful. So I think in either your slide or the video, it was talking about whole milk or whole milk, in a negative way. But this person is saying whole milk is unprocessed food. I eat a lot of cheese and whole milk for osteoporosis. Is that okay?
So yes, whole milk is technically a minimally unprocessed food, right? It comes directly from a cow. The only processing that happens would be pasteurization, right? And we want everybody to consume pasteurized dairy products, no raw and pasteurized dairy products whatsoever. But it does have a lot of calcium associated with it, which is where you're going to see sort of that information with osteoporosis. The only negative of whole milk is that it does have a high amount of saturated fat. Okay, so we said that high intakes of saturated fat, also including cheese, are more closely associated with an increase of LDL cholesterol. However, remember we talk about diet over a spectrum, right? If you're only eating those things, then yes, you're more than likely to have some dysregulation there. But if you're also eating fiber, you're also eating your fruits and veggies, you're getting your grains, your beans, you're more than likely not to have those things affect you if you're not over consuming them.
Thank you. I think in the group 1 to 4, when you talk about the process and minimally processed, you mentioned deli meat. So they were asking specifically about turkey deli meat.
Mm-hmm. So turkey and deli meats, unfortunately, most deli meats have added nitrites or nitrates. And I didn't really touch on this because I personally haven't done enough research, but I do know that there is a greater connection to nitrite and nitrate containing deli meat products and colorectal cancer. So there is some connection between just the meat specifically with the nitrates and nitrites and how it affects your GI tract. So that's where really more of that negative connotation comes from. Also, they have quite a bit of added sodium. They're just a processed version of that meat. So again, more of like that ultra processed food. But they are not necessarily high in saturated fat, but they do have the components similar to foods that are high in saturated fat in the sense that they have lots of salt and they are highly processed.
Makes sense. Thank you. Chemo has really affected my taste, and very little fresh veggies and fruits or they're not very appealing. Do you have any suggestions?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that just one more time?
Chemo has really affected my taste, and so fresh veggies and fruits are not very appealing. Do you have any suggestions?
Fresh veggies and fruits are not appealing because of chemo that has affected taste. So I would say add some things to it that can help with flavor enhancement, cinnamon, add in things, maybe just a splash of honey, maple syrup, those kinds of things that can help exacerbate some of the taste buds and pull those things out. Vegetables, maybe try like lemon, lime juice. You can add vinegars. You can add other spices and things. So really it's just, we think about the flavor enhancement when you're trying to get those taste buds back after.
Wonderful. So the suggestions for reducing inflammation, um, are they related to arthritis inflammation as well?
Yeah, arthritis is more complicated too. It's inflammation of the joints. I know for sure that exercise 100%, stretching, keeping your joints flexible and mobile, getting enough hydration, making sure you eat enough protein to help some of that muscle and that joint turnover, right? All those cells redevelop. So as far as reducing inflammation, it's again a systemic issue, right? And it's something that you can't always pinpoint 100%. But I know movement for sure is very helpful for arthritis, but you have to find the right movement that doesn't, cause you any sort of pain or discomfort.
Yes, thank you. How do you get grains without processing?
So again, remember there's minimally processed grains. I mean, almost all of these things that we're going to consume have some level of processing, right? Even oats. Oats have some level of processing, right? So an unprocessed version of oats would be steel cut oats, right? A slightly more processed or minimally processed version of oats would be the instant cooking oats, right? They've just been pressed out. But those are still considered good, and they have so many different qualities that are positive for us, right? They have the fiber, they have plant-based protein, and we know all of those things can help lower cholesterol. So oatmeal, brown rice, quinoa, you can do farro. All of those things are natural. Those things are sprouted. They are minimally unprocessed. So those are the ones I definitely recommend.
Well, thank you. Um, what about talking about deli meats? What about prosciutto that is uncooked or dry cured with no nitrates?
I would have to kind of look a little bit more. I know it's very common to eat those kinds of things like in Europe and, Italian food and Mediterranean food, Spanish, those kinds of cured meats are very, very common over there. The only thing I will say is that lifestyle is very different over there, right? There's a lot of other factors that may be different, lots of exercise, walking, there's other factors that can reduce their overall risk of these sorts of things. But what was the exact question again? I'm sorry.
I guess what are your thoughts about prosciutto that is uncooked or dry
Okay.
cured with no nitrate?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I would still say probably cook it. I don't know, but again, it still is going to be some version of, added salt and slightly cured. So just, again, be mindful of your total intake of these things. Don't overconsume anything except fruits and vegetables.
Balance is so important, right? Next question. Is there such a thing as too much chicken, especially if you don't like red meat?
That's a great question. I was speaking with a patient earlier today about chicken and this. So, I would say that again, as most things, overconsumption of anything is probably not the best, right? Because then you're missing out on diversity of other things. Chicken does have actually increased amounts of cholesterol, despite what people say. It is a lean animal protein, but it does actually contain quite a bit of cholesterol. So if you are trying to lower your cholesterol intake, maybe choosing alternative sources is a better option. Tofu, don't forget about tofu. Tofu is a great replacement for chicken. It does take a little bit of learning how to cook and dressing up and things, but I definitely would say, don't overconsume anything, right? Don't overconsume anything. Diversity across the board.
Wonderful.
We'll
If
probably have
there
time for like one more question.
Yes, absolutely. So if there's another question, feel free to put them into the chat. But I just want to thank you, Marissa, for just such just an informative presentation that's so easy to understand. I know this is such a complicated topic and a hot topic, but I enjoyed everything you said, so I'm so happy about that. The
Great, I'm
last
so happy.
question is your thoughts on salmon.
Thoughts on salmon? I mean, salmon's excellent. It's a fatty fish. It has the omega-3 fatty acids that we know are extremely important for brain health, for cardiovascular health. And omega-3s specifically can also help reduce systemic inflammation, right? So Omega-3s from fatty fish are slightly more easily absorbed and digested compared to some of the omega-3s that you find in plants, so like in seeds or nuts. But that doesn't mean that you should overconsume, the animal version just to get more. Again, diversity across the board, but salmon is considered to be very healthy. I know there's always questions about, as far as cholesterol, or not cholesterol, excuse me, mercury. So, just don't overconsume one single fish, just vary it up and just be mindful.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much, Marissa, for your time and your research and this wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining as well.
Thank you all so much.